So we have the, I think I got it set up to share the screen and stuff. But just kind of getting started, I guess you're going to explain a little bit about yourself and some of the projects and some of the things that you've had the opportunities to do. And yeah.
Yeah, I've got a whole presentation for you, man.
All right.
So I'll before I give anything away, I'll just follow the slides I put together. Let me know if you guys can see and hear everything. Feel free to interrupt. There's always the hands up option on Zoom. Rob, if you want to get a few words in at any point that I don't hear you or see you.
Oh yeah. Well, I could just go, you'll just hear me going, and cut you off a little bit.
Okay. Well, I made a fun little goofy set of slides for you guys that should explain the reason why I'm here and why Rob brought me in.
I'm just going to make it so it's just you or just the whole slides here. So I just want to stop, exit full stream. Anyone know how to make it so it's not us on the side here?
Click the side by side mode thing.
Right here?
No, the one that was in the options.
Side by side? Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Now it's on top.
Hide thumbnail. Okay. We're ready to rock, man.
Cool. Yeah. You should be seeing my screen with a goofy picture of me on the left and the title "Why I Study Earth from Space." Is that there?
Yeah. We got.
Okay.
We got you in the corner. So we got double Cassidy right now.
Oh man, that's almost too much. All right. Well, yeah, I wish I could be there in person, guys. We're playing things extra carefully. My wife is immune compromised. We had a health scare this past year that we're still in some recovery. So she's got compromised lungs, and I didn't want to take any extra chances. So I would love to be there and actually meet you guys. And it's always a better experience when we're face to face. But hopefully we can make that happen sooner than later. But for today, we're gonna see if this works from here. Rob, what do we have for timing? You said, give or take an hour.
Yeah, we don't really have much for constraints on our end. So, cool. Yeah, whatever works with your schedule, we can work it around that if you need to be somewhere in a little while.
I cleared 2 hours, so I'm good.
Okay, well, yeah, we're done school at 3, but I could stay a couple hours, but it might be tough for me to convince the others.
No. We won't go that long. It's just we got it if we need it. If there's people that want to talk more later, we'll do that too. But I've got maybe 15 or 20 slides. It's mostly photos of the travels I've done across the world in my science education and research background experiences, and kind of just wanted to give you guys an overview of some of the topics I wanted to cover in the coming weeks. Rob has invited me to speak for the next few Wednesdays in a row, if I'm not mistaken, Rob. Yeah.
As long as it works with your schedule and there isn't any big snow days, I guess hopefully we'll be seeing you.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I called this little talk "Why I Study Earth from Space," and to me, that's the general theme in what I do, which is remote sensing sciences, also known as Earth system sciences or Earth observation sciences. And it's a very holistic, integrative approach at looking at global change patterns, looking at how we measure how our planet is changing over time at all different scales, from being right in the dirt and actually looking at things from microbes to fungi, all the way out to cloud patterns and how air circulates around the planet, and how actions and activities on the ground from the micro to the macro scale all kind of connect to each other to contribute to the Earth system as a whole. Maybe you've heard the term spaceship Earth, and it's this idea that the Earth itself is a relatively closed self-contained life support system that supports, billions of lives, and is just floating in space, self-sustaining, and the systems that sustain it, these life support systems, is really what the focus of Earth System Sciences looks at all different scales. And it gets into aspects of biology and geology and marine sciences and technical aspects of like the instruments we use to measure this stuff from space. And so it's a very broad scope. I mean, it's the whole Earth. So there's a lot in there. But I'll revisit each of these kind of topics in a little bit more detail as the weeks go forward. I just wanted to introduce a couple of the components to each one of those topics and introduce myself in the process. So I've just moved to Vernon from Alberta. I grew up actually in the Edmonton area, and I went to school at the University of Alberta for 12 years. And before that, I did all my my grade schooling in a small community just outside Edmonton in the suburbs. But I was fortunate to be able to travel all over the world throughout my research and education career. And I got a really cool perspective on what's going on around the planet and where things are evolving with this this new frontier of integrated Earth sciences. So I want to thank you guys again for chatting with me today and in the weeks coming forward. So let's get on with it. So I'll start off with this picture. Does anybody, I don't know if I can hear you guys, we'll test that theory. Does anybody know what this is a picture of?
Is it light?
So you heard comet, light.
It's a good guess.
On there. Is that Earth from Voyager 1?
That is the Earth from Voyager 1. That's right on the money.
Yes.
Oh, that little circle?
So this is a photograph named the pale blue dot. And it was the very first photograph taken of the Earth, the entire Earth, from a very distant vantage point. This was actually taken from 6 billion kilometers away. And to put that distance in perspective, if it took you one day to travel around the entire Earth, it would take you 400 years at that speed to get this distance away from the Earth.
Whoa.
So that little tiny dot there is a famous photograph by a scientist and astronomer and planetary science specialist named Carl Sagan. If you're unfamiliar with the work of Carl Sagan, I highly recommend looking up the pale blue dot. There's an audio book, there's a YouTube video with some of his kind of highlights. But I'll start you off with the most famous quote, I think, from this photograph, which is, "From this particular vantage point, the Earth may not seem to be of any particular interest. But that's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." And so this photograph really empowered the idea during the space exploration phase of the 1970s and the early 1980s, when scientists were sending probes and spacecrafts out into the solar system for the first time to look at other planets from a closer vantage point. Scientists started to realize that we don't really have any tools to look at the Earth from space and actually understand our own planet with the same type of technologies. And so we were looking to the stars, and we were looking to the moon, and we were looking to Jupiter and Saturn and trying to understand where we fit in the big picture. And in the 1970s, they thought, well, let's point those cameras back at our own planet. And what can we learn from those images? And that's really when the science of remote sensing, which is what I am a self-proclaimed expert in, really started to think about, is how can we put systems in orbit, near or far orbit around our Earth, and start to understand how everything on the Earth is connected. So this is just something for you guys to think about here as we go into the rest of this discussion and in the weeks forward. We have a really cool geological record that tells us that it was very, very likely that at several points, at least 1 or 2 points in the Earth's history, the entire planet was covered in ice. And it's called the Snowball Earth hypothesis. And some people actually call it now the slush ball Earth hypothesis, because we don't know how solid it was. Maybe there were some parts of the tropics that were, still with liquid water and stuff. But it happened at very interesting points in the evolution of our planet, where multicellular animal and plant life were just starting to show up in the fossil record. And the evidence we have for the Earth being totally frozen over, the fact that it coincides perfectly in the fossil record with when we started seeing all these new critters evolving for the very first time, is something I want you guys to keep in mind and think about. What does this Snowball Earth have to do with what I'm going to talk to you about and the topics we'll cover in the coming weeks? But it lasted millions of years, and then something triggered it to thaw. We have no evidence that shows that the sun changed its power output in any significant ways. We have some evidence of some other things changing on the Earth, but something plunged the Earth into a total global ice age, and something took it back out millions of years later. And those somethings are things that I find very interesting and are very much related to what I've done a lot of research on in my science career. Now, on a totally opposite end of the spectrum, I'm going to try to play a soundbite for you guys from this place, which is a place I've done some research on. I did some field biology and field ecology in the tropics, and this is a relatively small island in Panama. And I'll see if I can share my audio. Share computer sound, and hopefully this works. And so this is me walking around in the forest, the tropical forest understory. You should be hearing some animal sounds come in here. And if you recognize the sound, just shout it out. So I'm walking back to the station as the sun is setting at the end of a long day in the field. It's about an 8-kilometer hike through the jungle. And suddenly this starts happening, this sound starts happening. These trees are 200 feet tall. And it starts getting louder every 20 seconds. And I'm getting a little bit nervous. I don't know what's out there in the jungle, but my field guys are with me and they live and work there all the time, and they're not panicking, so I'm not panicking. But I had to take out my phone and record it. I think there's one more. It's a deafening sound. Does anybody know what that was?
Is that a howler monkey?
A howler monkey?
Those are howler monkeys. That was the first time I heard howler monkeys up close and personal. And I continued to hear them at sunrise and sunset every day for the next 3.5 weeks that I was living in this jungle. But holy smokes, was it terrifying the first time.
Yeah. I did my honeymoon in Costa Rica, and the first time I heard a howler monkey, I was like, oh, like I just jumped out of my skin. It's just crazy.
they're pretty big. They're a relatively large monkey for the neotropical monkeys. And they're pretty harmless. They're just really good at making them sound intimidating. So from one spectrum to the other, frozen planet, lush tropical forest, these things are very related in a way that I'll hopefully clarify later. But so who am I? I wear a lot of hats. People ask me, what do I do? What do I do for a living? And that's usually what the question is about, is what do you do for a living? How do you make money? And I have a really hard time answering that question because I do a lot of things. And I try to make sure the things that I do the most are the things I enjoy. And if I make money doing them, that's a bonus. And so when I put my science hat on, I'm first and foremost a doctor of earth and atmospheric sciences. So I've taught courses at the University of Alberta on how to use computer systems to manage natural resources using spatial analytics and spatial data. I'm also a landscape ecologist, which means we try to look at how biological processes relate to each other at a whole landscape scale. And what happens when you change that landscape? How does it affect the wildlife? How does it affect the water? How does it affect the air quality? How do those things relate to each other? And if you change one, does it directly change the others, or is it an indirect relationship that takes time where there's a cascade effect? That's what landscape ecology looks at. And then more recently, I do a lot of forestry science, and that's more of a commercial research aspect to my education, is actually learning all the things that I learned about remote sensing and spatial data management and applying it to forestry sciences. So outside of that, I am an outdoor enthusiast. I am a extreme sport nut. I am a skateboarder, snowboarder. I used to be sponsored by a few different companies for skateboarding. I used to travel around Canada and do skateboard demonstrations and learn how to skate days. And it's hard to get me off a board unless I have to be. And then I'm also an entrepreneur. So I've been taking an interest in developing new technologies focused on spatial data, maps, geographic information systems, drones and satellites, and trying to find ways to meet the needs of what industry and commercial players and companies need for information services, for natural resource management from a landscape perspective. How much forest is in this area, how much water is in this area, what's the quality, what's the content, all of this kind of inventory management. And so I started a few companies, mostly using drones, so that anybody can kind of get a camera in the sky and start mapping and measuring stuff. And I help them understand how to turn those photos from the sky into information that they can use for business purposes, for land management, for insurance purposes, lots of different use cases for that. But I'll just go through a few photos here. So I love hiking. Here's a shot last year over in Kananaskis country, hiking up to the top with my dog. There's some shots of me on a board. So on the concrete or on the hill, I'll be the first one to throw myself off something before I look. I've gotten into a little bit of trouble doing that. A couple broken bones, but I'm still here. And then on the science side, I found some of the nerdiest pictures I could find of myself for you. So I did a lot of marine biology research out on the west coast of Vancouver Island. That's the top left, me looking at some phytoplankton and zooplankton under a microscope. Bottom left, I'm holding a prototype of a drone. Before you could buy these things in stores, we had to build them. We had to build them from components. And so that's me down in Australia working with the Australian federal government on how to use aerial technologies for forest fire planning and forest fire early warning systems. The middle two pictures are me down in Panama in that same jungle that I showed you that video clip of, just looking super nerdy, trying to keep all the bugs and critters out of my pants, tucking my shirt in and tucking my socks into my pants into my socks, and then you tape your socks to your pants, and then you cover yourself with sulfur powder to make sure that all the bugs and ticks and stuff don't get in your clothes. And then you spend the whole day out in the jungle taking notes and measuring locations. There's a GPS locator there, trying to measure how much light is reaching the forest ground. That little light sensor, it's a little black and white sensor in the middle of the screen next to the GPS device, actually tells us how much sunlight the forest canopy absorbs. And with that information, we can say how much carbon is the forest pulling out of the air, how much biomass or leafy and woody material is the forest converting the atmosphere into, at what rate does it do it, and how productive is it, and is it getting more productive or less productive with human involvement in the area. And then that picture on the right there, that's what I did for the vast majority of my graduate school. So master's and PhD program was building towers in the middle of nowhere in the tropics, and putting sensors on top to try to measure light reflections as a way to actually tell what species were there and what type of physiology does the landscape have. And this was all just kind of makeshift technology that we would take off the shelf components and try to build our own equipment, because there was nothing you could buy that would do this stuff. So that's the science hat. And I find, more than anything, if you want to learn about somebody, who they are, what their values are, what their experiences are, look at where they've been. And I'm a mapping guy. I love to make maps. I love to look at maps and use maps to communicate information. So for those of you who use Google Maps or Google Photos actually has a really cool timeline tool you can look at. So I've got mine open here. You can choose date, month, year, location history, and go in. So this will be all the places I've taken photos probably over the last few years just with this account. And so you can see the concentration of where I spend most of my time. So you can see I've got a lot of family in Edmonton. I've got a lot of family and friends in Calgary. I spend a lot of time out along the Trans-Canada. I grew up in the Shuswaps. My family is a third generation property and community management group in the North Okanagan or North Shuswaps Arms. This is the desktop version you see on a computer. What's even cooler, and maybe we'll look at it later, is if you do this on your cell phone, on the mobile device, and you go to your Google Photos, this turns into a heat map, and it's color coded based on where you take the most photos and where you spend most of your time. And you can look at anywhere you've been around the world and do a photo search. And I've done a lot of work over in Asia. I've done a lot of work in South America. So maps are fun, and this is a cool way to look at where you've been. And if you forget about where you took a specific photo or when it was in your history, the map tool is a really neat way to connect information spatially.
Whoa.
So where have I been? So this is one of my favorite photos of where I've been, because it just really helps put us into perspective. This is what they call, a very creative nickname for this is the big tree on that island in Panama. And it's a big tree. It's a very big tree, probably one of the biggest in the world.
It's crazy.
And those roots will go down hundreds of feet into the ground.
The question, any idea how old that tree is?
I have no idea, and the researchers don't know either. The best guess is somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. The interesting thing is the size of a tree doesn't tell you a lot about its age after about 100 years. And so there's trees in the north part of British Columbia that are probably twice as old as this tree, that are probably the same height as you. So because this is in the tropical country, this is in the equator, this is in Panama near the equator, where they have high humidity and high sunlight, nutrients galore, these trees can put on a lot of biomass in a short amount of time. I don't have the picture looking up the canopy of this thing, but for those of you that have seen Avatar, just picture a home tree, branches coming off this thing, the size of the biggest tree you'll find in the Okanagan. You look like you could live inside this thing, but those vines coming down, you know, that gives you an idea of just the scale of these plants in this area.
Wow.
I could actually show you really quickly on a map where exactly that is. I always like to look at maps in different angles, so it's a little bit upside down, but most of you may recognize that that is North America. Can I get it back up right? Painfully. So here we go. North and South America used to be separate continents, and then they slammed together a couple million years ago, and all the animals and plants from both continents kind of met at this one point called the Isthmus of Panama. And lots of neat things happened in that area when that occurred. But, you know, land animals that had never been north or south came together. The diversity of species in this area is like no other on the planet because two entirely separate continents came together at this point. So there's Panama, starts just where Costa Rica ends and then connects to South America there. What the Europeans did when they came and colonized it is they decided they needed a way to get from one ocean to the other without going all the way around both continents. So they created the Panama Canal. It took decades of work, hundreds of laborers in here. The project stopped and started more times than we can count because the diseases in the area and the mosquitoes basically were killing off all of the workers in the area. So they had to invent a way to control the mosquitoes before they could finish it. But what they did is they built a dam system and they just flooded the rainforest. So this is the Panama Canal. It's not a very straight line because what they did is they just blocked two ends of it and made all of the rivers in the area come into this one part of Panama. Flooded. And everywhere that you see water here used to be a valley, a mountain valley, and everywhere that you see what are now islands were the tops of the hills. And so that's what happens when you make a dam and a reservoir. And so this area here is called Barrow, Colorado Island. And this is the location of those big trees, or that big tree that I just showed you. There's a little tiny research station here. You take a little boat over basically hiking from one side to the other takes you most of a day, probably a 10-hour hike to get from this part of the island to the other side. And the canopies of these trees, they kind of look like broccoli from above here, but that's one single tree canopy if you can see my cursor. And that's probably 200 feet wide.
Wow.
So this is where I did some of my research with some really cool, interesting people trying to understand how some of the biggest, oldest trees in the tropics are adapting to climate change. And that's one of them. So I was out there wandering around, putting little weather stations everywhere and putting sensors on trees and towers and in the ground and trying to get that information all sent back to our labs at the University of Alberta. It's a good stopping point. You guys want to ask any questions about that before I keep going?
Any questions, gang? Oh, someone wants to know the name of your app. Which one? The Google one or the one to look at your pictures? The pictures.
Yeah. So if you have a Google account, like for a Gmail account or something, I mean, I know not all of you are going to be set up with a long timeline on a mobile phone, but it's just Google Photos, and it usually comes preloaded onto an Android phone if you use any Android devices, or you can go on your desktop computer and go to your Google Photos, and it usually has a backup of all the photos you've taken on your phone. It's like iCloud, but it's Google's version of iCloud, and you can go to a map view, and it shows you where all your photos have been taken over time, which is kind of a neat way to keep track.
When you're in Panama and you're doing the study on the trees there, and you're a student at University of of Calgary. Is that something through the university connected with the government there, or who's sponsoring you being there?
It's a good question. And I think this slide will answer some of those questions. So I did my undergraduate research in animal biology, and I looked at developmental biology of marine animals because they've been around older than any other animals. And I didn't get into doing actual research until my last year of my undergrad. And I joined a laboratory that had summer research work. And the summer research work was to go out to Vancouver Island and take those samples from the rocky shores, and then take them back to the University of Alberta and study them. So that was somebody else's research group that they had got federal funding through both national and provincial programs. And that let me do a little summer internship, which was really cool experience. And it got me hooked on the concept of doing research and traveling. So it doesn't, a scientist isn't somebody who's just always sitting in the lab. Well, we did a lot of the actual measurement work in that lab, in an actual lab. A lot of the most interesting work we did was going out into the field and collecting samples. So I love that so much that I actually started looking for other programs at the University of Alberta that had kind of like short-term summer internship or field collection projects. And I ended up finding one that was a tropical research group. And it was a group at the U of A called the Earth Observation Systems Laboratory. Now, at the time, this was a brand new science field, an integrated science field, bringing in chemists and biologists and computer scientists, and everybody was to work together to try to solve some big global change problems. And part of the problem was we had these sensors out on satellites orbiting the planet, taking measurements of things on how the Earth's surface was changing due to human activities. And we needed to know how accurate that information was because, and I'll get into this more in a little bit, but when you put something up into the Earth's orbit, you're putting it basically into space where it's really, really, really cold. If you've ever tried to use your iPhone in the cold, it doesn't work that well. And there's all this solar radiation, high intensity radiation as soon as you get outside the Earth's protective magnetic sphere. And so electronics in space really, they break down and they wear down really quickly. So if we want to measure changes on the Earth over a long period of time, we have to make sure these instruments are working properly over those periods of time. It's called calibration. And so a big part of what we did was we got funding from international groups like United Nations. This specific project was funded by a group called the Inter-American Group for Global Change Biology, and they're funded by the World Bank. And basically there was a collaboration between the University of Alberta in Canada, a bunch of universities across Central and South America, where everybody kind of pooled their resources and tried to create an initiative or a project where a bunch of local students out of colleges and universities could get out into the field with some of the technology that we've been developing in Alberta. Now we worked with the University of BC as well and some universities in Toronto. And we brought these gadgets, these electronics down and taught local students how to use them. So on that right side of this picture, there's a whole bunch of wires and little electronic circuit boards. These were pretty Mickey Mouse systems. They're like little, maybe $30 circuit boards that we had kind of configured in a way to take in measurements from kind of handmade temperature sensors and humidity sensors like you'd find on a little weather station. And we trained them to manage them and collect the data. And then when they got back to their cities, they would upload them on the internet and we would have the data on a dashboard that people could actually look at from anywhere on the internet. So funding came from a few different places. And I was fortunate enough to I applied for a summer program that gave me additional funding to travel. So it covered all my air travel and it covered all my food and hotels and travel expenses to go do this work.
Cool, cool.
So what you're looking at here, this is about halfway through the 5-year project. I was going down to places like Mexico near Puerto Vallarta, building towers with the forest rangers who are in charge of making sure that poachers don't come in and poach animals and wildlife illegally. They would help me get, some of the infrastructure to get like car batteries, put them into boxes so that the hot tropical weather doesn't destroy them, and then build up these little radio towers that we would put little sensors all over. And the sensors were measuring essentially the breathing of the forest, how much carbon was getting sucked into the landscape and how much oxygen the forest was releasing, and how the weather was affecting how the forest was breathing. So these little time series graphs, these little colorful lines are days of the year. And over 1 year here, what we're measuring things like how much does it rain and how much does that rainfall cause the forest to breathe more deeply and produce more fruits and flowers and leaves, as a way to measure how productive the landscape is and how the climate and the weather system interact to control those things. And so I didn't really know much about what I was doing. I was just a guy who was able to go into these really harsh working environments, look at cool bugs and critters while I was just setting up electronics and teaching local students and research groups how to maintain them and collect the data. It wasn't for a few years that I actually looked and understood the big picture of what we were trying to measure, which was essentially the influence of climate change on environmentally sensitive protected areas. And so this is just a map of some of the sites that I've worked in Central and South America, setting up. I think I set up about 150 sensor stations. I built about 25 meteorology towers, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
How long would one of those towers take to build, Cassidy? It looked like they're pretty tall.
It's a good question. They ranged in size, probably from, I think our shortest one, because what we actually looked at was how forests grow back over time. So we would set up observation towers in newly cleared forest landscapes. So like where a farmer has come in and cleared the land to put in cattle for beef. And then the government pays them to let the forest grow back. And so we would put in small towers, like maybe 20 feet tall, and just look at, small scale measurements. And then all the way to, I think we had a 250-foot tower I worked on in Australia that was trying to measure the footprint of something like 1,000 square kilometers of area around it. So some of them would take you 5 minutes to climb up. Some of them would take you an hour to climb up. But building them, yeah, it would vary on the size of the tower. It could be a couple days. Dig a hole, put in the foundation. So you're pouring concrete and putting in the metal posts. And then once you've got the foundation in place, you start putting on like a 6-foot section. And then you tie metal wires, these guy wires to hold it. And then you climb up with the next 6-foot section, more guy wires. And basically the amount of time it took depended on time, or depended on if you had materials available, or if you had to go drive 3 hours down muddy, dirty roads to find the nearest, construction supply store. And how we doing? We still got about half hour, right?
Yeah. We might not make it.
Cool. Well, then I'll just give you guys a quick overview of like 4 or 5 topics that I want to get into more detail in the coming weeks. But this is the main one. So this Earth System Sciences was a relatively new field of science about 20 years ago. It was just starting to become this concept of how do we get water ecologists and desert geologists working with soil microbiologists and atmospheric gas monitoring scientists, all working together and try to fit the pieces of the whole Earth system together. And that's what's called Earth System Science. And it's really bringing together the 4, some people say 5 major spheres of what makes the Earth system. That's the air or the atmosphere, the water or the hydrosphere, the land, also known as the lithosphere, and the life or the living things, which is the biosphere. So those are the fancy names for all those things. There's also, some people break the hydrosphere into the liquid component, or the oceans and the lakes and the rivers, and then the ice as a separate sphere, the cryosphere. Cryo being Latin for frozen. And, because they kind of interact differently. And as we get into global change monitoring, we want to know, how is the ice changing versus the liquid components of the water on the Earth. But those are the fancy names for all the different spheres of influence that are kind of interacting together to make the Earth system, go round. So this is probably a more realistic view of what we actually measure for Earth systems. Is it's really everything on the Earth is driven by the sun. So the energy that comes in from the sun is kind of the first place you start. You look and you measure how much energy is coming at us from space. Because without that energy from the sun, there's not a lot going on this rock. And then you start to look at, okay, well, that first, it hits the atmosphere. So how does that interact with the air, the little thin layer of air around our planet? And to put it in perspective, if you took an apple and you looked at the thickness of the wax layer on top of the apple, that's about how thick our atmosphere is on our Earth. So very, very thin layer of gas. And how does that energy from the sun and space, interact to drive all the weather patterns? How do the living things in the soil then change as the weather changes? And everything's connected in this Earth system picture. And so that's one of the things I'm going to dive into. Probably next week would be the time to do it, is to do a little talk on what is Earth system sciences, why do we measure it, what can you do with it, the basics and the intro to that. The next thing I'd probably want to talk about is the science of where. Now that's an expression that's been coined by a company called Esri, and they've built a software that does this GIS. And GIS is Geographic Information Systems. And it's basically taking any information with a location and putting it into one computer system that can manage that data with locations to kind of help you figure out spatial connections between things and managing different components with spatial information. So an example of a GIS is Google Maps. Google Maps, you can put in my location, where I want to go. It'll give us our best route. And that's one use case for a spatial data management system, is find me the fastest route from A to B. And you can think of that as one question I'm trying to answer by looking at distances and spatial connections. But there's so many questions we can ask when we look at the landscape about the environment and about water resources and vegetation, that the development of this science of where has been very important in making that a reality. I'll talk more for sure about remote sensing, and in its simplest form, what remote sensing is, why we use it, this concept of Earth observation science, which is really just putting sensors up in orbit or on airplanes or on drones and looking at the landscape from above. There's something called the overview effect. And it's this feeling that astronauts get when they leave the Earth and they're going into space and they're looking down over the Earth, and they get this sense of a complete understanding that everything on the Earth is connected. It's called the overview effect. And, many astronauts say they feel this overwhelming sense of understanding of our place on Earth in the cosmos, this big realization that, everything is connected. So that's really an underlying theme of what happens when you start putting sensors further and further away from the planet and looking back at it. So Earth observation sciences, using things to look at our own planet from a distance. How do we do that, right? Like, what are we actually doing when we put a $20 million camera up in orbit? And so the basics of it are the fact that there's a whole spectrum of light out there that our eyes don't see. So if you look around you and you look at any object in the room, your brain will look at the shape of it. Your brain will look at the intensity of light in different wavelengths. And your brain will say, oh, so this wavelength of light is brighter, and this wavelength of light is not as bright. And I know that that object is a desk. That's the simplest way to kind of look at what remote sensing is. And the cool thing is that computers and electronic eyes can see many more wavelengths of light than we can. We can see red and green and blue, and we can see those pretty good. We've got really cool receptors to do that. But there's robotic eyes that can see wavelengths of light way higher energy and way lower energy. So it's like looking at things, on steroids, just magnified in so many different spectrums. And every single object and every single chemical has its own special fingerprint when you look at it across all those wavelengths of light. So we'll talk more about what remote sensing is, how that works, the science of that, because it lets us do some really cool things from space, like look at the temperature of the planet, at really high resolution on every point of the Earth. We can measure clouds and rainfall. We can measure, carbon cycles and how crops are growing and you name it, right? So the science of how we do that is really what interests me and helps Earth observation scientists understand, how to keep track of everything that's changing on the planet, from how the Earth's plates colliding contribute to different climate patterns, to how different soil types are distributed, and looking at it really from a big picture. Another topic that I want to cover is the breathing of the Earth. So just stop and look at this image for a bit. You don't normally see this perspective from our planet. But every single year when winter comes to the northern hemisphere, plants go to sleep, snow covers the surface. And when you take thousands of images from satellites and put them together into one picture over time, you get this. And what does it remind you guys of?
Breathing, a heart.
Yeah, like almost a beating heart, right? It's this pulse of our planet every single season, in and out, that renews the energy cycles of the air we breathe, of the water we drink, of the animals and the plants that we depend on, and measuring the signal that comes off it. If you think of like how a heart monitor has a little wavelength, that shape of that little blip changes every year. So you can think of the snow cover or the green cover lasting longer or shorter on a year-by-year basis, and how that little pattern of the heartbeat or the pulsing or the breathing of our planet changes from year to year tells us a lot about how the resources that we rely on are changing and how we may be influencing them. So here's another view of that, looking at maybe a more familiar map view on the bottom there.
Looking at the breathing Earth, Cassidy, did they use like I think about I think about tree core samples. Do they use like things on the Earth to check it against, or known things, or is this all just using different instruments?
So the key to utilizing remote sensing information to understand questions, very specific questions of what's happening on the ground, like how old are these trees, or How long has this stream been here? Or what is the water quality in that stream? If you want to know more than what you can physically see here in the imagery, you need information on the ground. So this picture tells us, where the plants are growing and when they're growing, where the snow is and when it melts, but it can't tell us what plants are there. It can't tell us, did a human plant it? The questions about what's actually happening on the ground, if you can't physically see it in the data coming to the satellite sensor or to the airplane sensor, you need a ground measurement to make this relationship between what the light signals are telling you and what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of, that was the kind of the connection, right? There needs to be that connection between the instruments and actually what's going on. And I guess things would need to be recalibrated or adjusted.
Yeah. And that's what field ecologists are great for. I mean, and wildlife biologists are people going out and getting all this data of what's happening on the ground that are maybe too small of detail or too fine of resolution that you can't pick it up directly from a sensor in space. But the way that the signals are coming in the electromagnetic spectrum, you can correlate or make these relationships between wildlife populations in certain areas based on what we can measure from space.
Cool.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about how do we measure that, what it tells us, why do we care about measuring that. That stuff I find really fascinating, and hopefully you guys do too. Another topic we might cover, if there's enough interest in it, is what LiDAR is. It's this really cool new technology, relatively new. It's getting used more and more these days to actually map out landscapes and look at 3D structure of things like forests or underwater. I'll give you guys some examples of the kind of cool things you can measure with lasers mounted on airplanes or drones. But yeah, lasers in the sky, lasers in the jungle, lasers all over the place. They tell us a lot. And we're just getting to a point now where the cost of these technologies are at a place where, almost anybody can afford to start playing around with them and learning how to use them. And the last one I wanted to kind of put up front here is something I wanted to introduce you guys to, if you've never heard of this, is soundscaping. And its other name would be acoustic ecology. And it's the concept that you can go out to any place and just make a recording of the sounds that you hear on the landscape, whether it's wildlife, biologically created sound, or whether it's geologically created sound. That could be water running, it could be the wind moving through the air. Or if it's human-made sounds, is there an airplane going by overhead? Is there a car driving by? That's the different soundscapes in an area tell you a lot about how intact the ecosystem is, what kind of species live there, how much disturbance we make. I believe there's less than 2% of the entire Earth's surface where you cannot hear the evidence of human civilization anymore. And so it's affecting wildlife, it's affecting how ecosystems function in really interesting ways that we're just starting to understand. But this is a really cool new field where it's still a type of remote sensing. You're not using light waves, but you're using sound waves to take recordings of an entire integrated environment and pick up things like, is there one type of frog species here? Is there 4 types of frog species here? How abundant is that? Is there, is it mostly the boreal wood frog, or is it mostly another type of frog? And you can do that now with these soundscaping devices and software. So that's a really neat field that I'm very interested in. I've worked with researchers that have done this, and we try to calibrate these measurements from soundscaping data sets to satellite measurements to figure out, this is a young forest that's maybe only 20 years old. How much of the biodiversity has come back, and can we measure that from sound sensors and then map that across the entire landscape to understand how age and disturbances on the landscape influence what animals are coming back and how abundant they are. Yeah, so I'll just finish off and let you guys let you know what I'm doing with all this. I mean, I've given talks all over the world on this type of technology. I've advised on NASA's space programs, European Space Agency programs, taking some of the experiences I've had with putting electronics in the forest, in the jungle, and talking to city planners on how they can put sensors in cities to better monitor how people use the city, called smart city planning. I've given talks in Southeast Asia and Singapore on that. And I've gotten a really cool perspective of all these different uses of remote sensing technologies from all over the world. And now I help people understand how to use remote sensing technologies to solve real world problems. So I'm currently working a lot on how to use lasers from airplanes and satellites to actually help foresters understand what trees are on the landscape. So that picture on the left is guys going and measure the diameter of a tree trunk, and that tells them how much wood is there and how much carbon is there in that tree. But it's, as you can imagine, it's very time consuming to do that for an entire forest. So we take those measurements and then we use the remote sensing data and images and 3D models, and we use that to predict what's there on the entire landscape and help people understand, is climate change putting certain inventory of my forest at risk? Where should I cut first? If trees have a shelf life like a food in your fridge, when's the best time to cut them down? Like when are they most ripe to capture that carbon and put it into building materials and try to support sustainable forestry? And that's a lot of information, so let's leave it there.
Yeah. We can make it so we can. I'll turn on the lights, Cassidy, and
Okay.
I guess we could do a bit of a. Do we have any questions? I think maybe first maybe we'll do, if we see if we have any questions, we'll do a bit of a reflection circle here, and we'll just kind of go around and people will say something that they thought was interesting, or something that they learned, or something they thought was pretty cool. So we'll start over here with Gabe in the pink hat.
I think the video with the Howler Monkeys was.
Wait, okay, you hear that? He said he liked the video of the Howler Monkeys.
I'll take it.
Yeah. No.
I found how they're using new sort of laser technology, I guess, to map out areas was pretty cool from planes and stuff.
Yeah, the LiDAR, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Riley, the photo app. You want to see where you've been on this planet? Yeah. Oh, you, Brent?
I thought what you just shared about that. Did you say that we're less than 2% of the Earth? You can't hear humanity or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not a lot of space.
No, it's not.
I thought it was cool how the Earth had like a heartbeat with the snow.
Yeah, like how the Earth's a heartbeat, like it's a living, breathing thing, right? Yeah.
I don't know. It was all cool. I liked it.
It's all cool.
It's all cool. Good. Kia.
I really like the LiDAR as well. I'm learning about that now.
Nice.
I just thought like the lasers in the sky thing. I thought that was neat.
Yeah, the whole LiDAR, right? Yeah, where do you think where do you think LiDAR is going to go? Like, where's it going? Because it seems like it's developing pretty quick. Like,
Yeah.
what won't it be able to do looking at the landscape? They're going to be able to have measurements to super small areas on the landscape and know exactly the difference between, you know, the ground and all kinds of different things. But what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so it's changing. The tech is changing very quickly. It's still an expensive type of data to collect over really large areas, but it's much cheaper than it used to be to do it at smaller scales using like a drone. So when I was in Panama, I remember the day that they were doing the flyover with an airplane that had 4 high-powered laser or LiDAR systems on it. The guy said, between 2 in the afternoon and 3 in the afternoon, don't look up because those lasers will burn your retinas. And I thought, well, how do we tell the monkeys that? Like, the monkeys are going to be confused when they see an airplane flying low over the forest. So it used to be a very, like, those lasers cost about $1.5 million each. And this was a custom designed aircraft. And so they could only afford to do the survey once. They did one scan in, like, I think it took them a month to cover all of Panama. And it was like they put all their money into this one basket. And if the weather didn't work out, too bad. But it was the first time they'd ever seen a 3D structure of every single tree in Panama. That was about 7 years ago. Today, you can put a similar type of laser scanner on a drone for probably 1% of the cost and survey an area the size of a soccer field, you know, in a single 10-minute flight. And then you have tools on your computer that you can look at that data and make cool maps and models of the terrain and how the water will flow and what vegetation is there. And what's interesting is LiDAR is becoming cost effective because of self-driving cars. And everybody's trying to develop a technology for cars to be able to see where they're going on the roads. And people are taking those innovations and putting them onto things like drones and seeing how they work and putting the ones that work well onto bigger aircrafts. And the cost is coming down and down and down and down. So it's pretty cool to see what I call the democratization of remote sensing. So we're going to see more and more of this LiDAR becoming, you know, commercially available to consumers, to researchers, to field ecologists. So I'm excited to see, you know, that trend continue.
Yeah, cool. Austin.
It's like seeing the biosphere, the hydrosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, all that. Fascinating. Love the LiDAR, all the technology that's being used.
Yeah, it just fascinates me. It just boggles my mind that you said that it went down. The cost has gone down so much in 7 years. So I guess since you first started doing, you know, remote sensing, the game's changed quite a bit.
Significantly. Yeah, it's, you know, you used to have to pay, and this is, you know, maybe 10 years ago, to get one image from a satellite that was taken within the last 3 months. You'd have to, you know, you have to put in a custom order, tens of thousands of dollars to get one picture of, let's say, your town taken from a satellite. And it would take months of processing to get the data. Now there's companies that have satellites up there that give you an image every single day of every single part of the Earth's surface. And that's just in the last 10 years. So we're seeing more and more of these microsatellites go into low Earth orbit instead of a government spending tens of millions of dollars on a satellite the size of a school bus that takes 10 years to launch. There's companies like SpaceX that are making lots of these little micro satellite cameras that go up into these fleets of sensors. So it's making the science and the application of the information happen really fast and to help us solve problems like a lot quicker than we used to be able to.
Dill.
I'm still trying to figure out everything you said because that was just a lot of information for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I tend to do that.
Well, I videotaped it so you could rewatch it, Dill. Lucy, how about you? What was your thoughts? Oh, she says she's been distracted and she's researching those big trees.
Yeah, the island was called Barrow, Colorado Island.
Barrow, Colorado Island.
Barro. They've had 100 years of tropical ecology research on that island now. Very cool place.
Yeah, and when you're looking at using remote sensing and LiDAR, when I in a former life when I was doing forestry work, I did a couple summers doing timber cruising, right? Where we're the guys on the ground that are actually trying to give the companies, I guess, the information about, you know, the volume and the species and the terrain that's out there. And now it's like that information could be quickly obtained from satellite imagery. And is it precise enough to be able to determine species? Like,
not as precise as you might need from space. So anywhere you can't get that kind of level of detail from orbital technologies like satellites, where it's much more cost effective. We still have to use airplanes and drones for higher resolution, like individual species.
Right. So you would use the same idea, but at a lower, like within our atmosphere, using drones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends on what accuracy you need, and we'll talk about that on the remote sensing introduction. But it's always a trade-off between really, really high accuracy and, you know, low cost data options. So you can, like, say in this little stand of trees, I've got 95% confidence that this is Douglas fir, but that's going to cost you $100 an acre. Or you could say I've got 50% confidence that this is mostly Douglas fir, and that might cost you $2 an acre. So it's always those trade-offs.
Right. Cool. Yeah, and I guess I never ever thought about, you know, you mentioned about the lasers actually, you know, don't look up, because there are all these lasers that are shooting down to get image to figure out what the Earth looks like. And that was something that's never even entered my brain. It's like, what could be some of the problems associated with that? And like when you said about howler monkeys or other and other organisms in the forest, I just wonder if it has any effect, or if it's just benign, I guess.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about that here. That was a very high powered laser to get through several layers of canopy and even into the understory. So you would never need to use a laser that power in almost any other place on Earth. So all of the stuff that is commercially available is regulated, you know, for wavelength. So they use a green wavelength of light that is eye safe. And you can't put anything on an aircraft that doesn't have federal permission for laser scanning for safety reasons.
Oh, so yeah, there'd be regulations with all this type of stuff, I guess, right?
Yeah. People will make their own systems and put them on drones now, but you can get in a lot of trouble if you do it the wrong way.
And it seems like recently they're really tightening up drone usage as well, like where and when and how you can use drones, and having to have like a bit of a licensing to it if the drones are over a certain size. Is that correct?
Yep, for sure. We when I started my first drone service company in 2014, we were the only ones in the entire province that had a license to operate. And nowadays it's a very different landscape. And the regulation has changed a lot with it, and it's a whole other topic. But they've actually made it significantly easier than it used to be. Because they've got a better framework to manage it all.
Cool. Austin, are you still comfortable thanking Cassidy?
Sure. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity that you provided and all the information here. As you said, you're going to do more presentations in the future. I'm excited to see that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I did want to finish on this question that I posed at the beginning, you know, around the ice-covered Earth and what that has to do with all the other things I talked about. It's a very interesting story that I'll go into more detail in another talk, but the leading theory on how the Earth suddenly became covered in ice like this was that a little tiny single cellular organism, the size of a head of a pencil, evolved the ability to convert the energy in sunlight and water into organic material. It's the process we now call photosynthesis. But when that evolved on the planet, it was the first time our spaceship Earth had ever seen a chemical reaction that could do that. There was no non-living process that could do that on the Earth. And so because it was such a advantageous, beneficial chemical biological process, it spread across the Earth like wildfire. And these organisms replicated. They're now the most similar modern day relative would be algae, but essentially it sucked all of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And when those organisms died and fell to the ocean floor, that carbon was locked down at the bottom of the ocean. And what happened was suddenly there wasn't enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to maintain a temperature where water could be liquid. And so this is one of many interesting stories like this, where living things can change the chemistry of the entire planet and rapidly change the climate with very, very significant consequences. So, when people talk about climate change and human influences on climate change, these are stories we need to remember, that the geological record has shown us even simple organisms can change the climate of the entire planet. And so understanding how those things happen is one of the key focuses of Earth system sciences. So we'll talk about other stories with examples of that happening on later lectures.
Awesome, Cassidy. Yes, Snowball Earth, pretty cool to think about. Right, and even when you look at within our region here, in the last, 2 million years, we did a talk with an expert on megafauna from Beringia, and looking at how many glaciation periods we've had in our area in the last even 2 million years, right? And just that the climate or the planet isn't static, and it's constantly changing. And I guess it's understanding what are these driving forces, and what happens when something happens over here. How is it going to affect things over here? And it seems like we don't have a complete picture yet.
Yeah, we're getting closer. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Cassidy. It is 3. We got people chomping at the bit, but yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks for putting up with my lengthy introduction, and I look forward to chatting more.
I have videoed this. Are you cool if I put this on our school's Facebook site?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Bye.